and welcome you all here to our final meeting of 2020. I think if you're interested in knowing, I think we are over 70 joining us at the moment and rising. And again, from the virtually from the comfort of your homes or from the virtual comfort of your homes. But we hope to be back together in person before too long, although I fear it will not now be until the spring at the very least. Once again, in the absence of our preliminary tea and cakes, we're going to have our breakout rooms again, randomly allocated so that we can socialize at the end. It seems to be working very well. Could I just remind you at this stage, please, to mute yourselves and to turn off your cameras to save the bandwidth for this meeting. May I now ask the Secretary to read the minutes of the last meeting of the 17th of November 2020.
The first meeting of the 128th season took place online via Zoom on Tuesday, the 17th of November. Professor James Raven, President, was in the chair. After the minutes of the previous meeting had been read and signed, the President introduced Mr. Adrian Edwards, who delivered a paper entitled Insights into the King's Library of George III. When the meeting was open to discussion, the following took part: the President, Professor Miriam Foote, Mr. Robert Lorry, Professor Nicholas Pickwood, Dr. Christian Jensen, Ms. Margaret Ford, Professor Goswell Boutros, Ms. Elizabeth Ashby, and Dr. Georgiana Ziegler. The President thanked Mr. Edwards warmly for his paper.
Thank you. Can I ask members to confirm that they're a correct record, please?
Yes.
Thank you. Yes, our Secretary has that. Thank you. And now, just as a preliminary note, our speaker today has asked that for questions, I'm just giving this early on, can you please type the questions into the chat function, if possible? Thank you. And now, we're delighted to have as our speaker at this meeting a lecturer who hardly needs any introduction from me, David Shaw. David, of course, has been a member of the Bibliographical Society for more than 50 years, and his involvement has been particularly with the Society's publishing programme, variously as chairman of the Publications Committee, as honorary editor of monographs, and he's currently a hugely valued honorary editor of electronic publications. He was for many years editor-in-chief of the Cathedral Libraries Catalogue Project, and it is, of course, a past president of the Society, serving from 2002 to 2004. Earlier, going back, David taught French for many years. I think someone could turn off your mute, please. Thank you. David taught French for many years at the University of Kent, and following retirement was secretary of the Consortium of European Research Libraries. As you will know, his area of research has been on the history of printing in the 15th and especially the 16th centuries. And until the COVID lockdowns, he was voluntary editor of the English short title catalogue at the British Library, and he remains a volunteer at Canterbury Cathedral Archives, working on recording the printed matter from the archive deposits. Today, David is speaking on Paper for Octavos, Innovation in Early 16th Century Book Production. David.
Good, here comes the share screen. I hope that's going to work. Good, I can see it on my own machine. So, Paper for Octavos, looking at innovation in the early 16th century. I'm going to talk first of all about medieval paper, and that will be totally derivative. I'm then going to talk about the Aldine octavos, which will be partly derivative, and then I'm going to talk about octavos after Aldus, which I think largely won't be derivative. So here's a major derivative part about medieval paper. I knew nothing about this until I started researching the area, and I was much helped by a long piece by Neil Harris, for which I've given the link below, who was himself drawing on Paul Needham's work. But the important thing about medieval paper is that in the Museo Civico Medievale in Bologna, there is a stone put up by the Papermakers Guild, presumably, giving the dimensions of the 4 sizes of paper which were authorized to be made. And they're imperiale, reale, mesane, and resute. And in English, imperial, royal, median, and chancery. And I've given the typical dimensions of them there. And so this is all derived particularly from work that Paul Needham has done. The shape of the medieval sheet of paper is very interesting, and to refer to it, we divide the height of the sheet by its width and cite the ratio. And the ratio of all of those 4 sizes of paper is 1 to 1.41. And this, interestingly, and I didn't work this out for myself, I read it in one of the papers I've mentioned, this is equivalent to the ratio of 1 to the square root of 2. So someone in the Middle Ages is applying mathematics to the dimensions of paper. And this is, interestingly, the same ratio as the modern A series of papers, which we use here in Europe in particular, the ISO standard 216, with A4 as our normal size of paper. A chancery sheet is somewhat near A3 in size, for example. So just like the modern A3, A4, A5 papers, when one of these medieval sheets is folded in 2, the height to width ratio remains more or less constant. So in other words, when you fold a sheet of paper once to give folio format, its overall shape is the same. And when you fold it a second time for quartos, the overall shape stays the same. And for the purpose of this lecture, the third fold gives you octavo format, and it retains the same shape as the unfolded sheet. And as a footnote, this is not the case for 12mo, 18mo, 24mo, etc., because they require a second fold into 3, and so the ratios are very, very different. So a chancery sheet with its ratio of 1 to 1.4 something gives an octavo page of nearly 16 centimeters by 11.5 centimeters before it's trimmed, and the ratio is about 1 to 1.4. So I hope you'll remember that 1 to 1.4, because it's going to be an undercurrent, especially in the third half of this talk. Here's a very useful illustration from a page on the Schoenberg Institute at the University of Pennsylvania. It shows 3 manuscripts in folio format, so they're all formed of sheets which have been folded once, and they've put a playing card on one of them as an indication of approximate size. So the large one is a single fold of royal paper, the middle one a single fold of median paper, and the next one is a fold of chancery paper. So the format in each case is folio, but the resultant page size depends on the sheet size which you chose for your book. And here's another illustration from the same source. These are 5 manuscripts, 15th century manuscripts, all written on chancery paper, and we've got the playing card there for comparison again. The top one here is a 16mo. Underneath it is an octavo. Underneath that is a quarto. By the side is an agenda quarto, where the twofold rather have been made in the same direction, and underneath the lot is a folio. So starting with chancery paper of a fixed size, you get the smaller formats, and by using larger sheets of paper, you'll get the same format reductions but larger page size outcomes. So Paul Needham's work has made all that very clear, and in his examination of incunable printed books, he's identified some other sheet sizes which he calls super something or other, super royal, super median, and super chancery. These sheets are somewhat wider than super chancery is wider than chancery, but the same height. And when you do the width to height ratio, the ratio is 1 to 1.3 instead of 1 to 1.4. This may not seem a lot, but in fact, it's sufficiently significant to be a marker for these different sizes of original sheets of paper. And of course, with these variant sizes, when they're folded, they don't preserve the ratio as the chancery papers did, and as our modern A series of papers do. So if you fold a supermedian sheet, which itself had a ratio of 1 to 1.3, uncut, you get a ratio of 1 to 1.5. So these ratios are quite significant markers. It's one of Paul Needham's frequent complaints that cataloguers and bibliographers should, but don't, record page dimensions, and that they should use the page dimensions to calculate the sheet size, and then to look up and find what sheet size that is and to give it a name, all of which can be done from the format and the page dimensions. And by and large, people don't do that. And even those cataloguers who record the height of the volume in centimeters don't help, because they don't typically give the width as well, and you never know whether they're measuring the page size or the binding. Will Noel and colleagues at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia, when Will Noel was still there, produced a website called the Needham Calculator. And I've given the links for it here, but you can search on Google for Needham Calculator and you can find it, and that will help. You can type in the height and the width and the direction of the chain lines and click the button, and it will attempt to tell you what sheet you're dealing with. And Paul Needham insists to me that he had nothing to do with the creation of this. They merely based themselves on his data, and that he never uses it. Though I take that as true, since he told me. His the example of the page. You can do it for single sheets or for pages in the book, height, width, direction of the chain lines. Very rarely use that because usually there is no decal because books have been ploughed by the binder, and you click on calculate. We'll see an example of this in use later on. So let's move on into the 16th century, which was in fact promised in my title. And we come to the Aldine octavos. 1501, a series of linked innovations by Aldus Manutius in Venice. It was a novel, a new innovative publisher's series, which were plain text editions of classical authors, Latin and Greek, and some of the Italian classic authors too. They were in octavo format, which is an innovation for the production of classical texts. They were in italic type, which had never existed before. Aldus had the first italic type specially created for this new series. And they also had an undecorated appearance. They had just plain one size of italic type, no woodcuts, no ornamental initials, nothing, but they're very distinctive because of this. But they also have a new page size, which is where they come in my narrative today. They have tall, slim pages, uncharacteristic of traditional octavo format. So here are some examples using the Aldine, Juvenal and Persius of 1501, which was, I think, the fourth edition to be produced by Aldus. The title page here is always very, very plain, just the names of the authors here, nothing else, no decoration. Title page verso has a preliminary letter by Aldus to a patron, and the first page of text typically looks like this, with a space for an ornamental initial, which was rather old-fashioned by this time, no ornamental initials, headings in the Roman capitals of the italic font, spaced capitals for the beginnings of the lines of verse, and that's it. And of course, we know that this innovative format was immediately popular. We know that Jean Grelier and his friends collected the things and bound them very ornately. We know that other publishers copied the series. I've given here an image of the colophon of the Junta, Juvenal and Persius, Florence, 1513. You can see the colophon of Filippo di Junta here, and it's in italic type. It copies the Aldine text, and it actually has copied the final errata list from the 1501 Aldine edition, which I think didn't serve any real purpose in a reprint 13 years later. But there's an indication that the format was innovative and rapidly adopted as suitable for producing small format classical texts. So let's look then at the paper for the Aldine octavos. It was recognized in the 19th century that they were very elegant. And the reason why is that they're tall and slim. The Aldine sheets are squarer than the standard median or chancery sheets, with the width to height ratio of 1 to 1.2. But of course, when they're folded, they don't retain that ratio. When they're folded once or 3 times, as for octavo, you get a ratio of 1 to 1.6 something or other. And so I've given a little table here of chancery at the bottom, giving a ratio of 1 to 1.4, super chancery octavos a ratio of 1 to 1.5, and the Aldines with 1 to 1.6 something or other. So the paper is part of Aldus's innovation here. And in Paul Needham's system of names, he calls this narrow median, that essentially the sheet is a bit larger, a bit squarer than median, but when it's folded, the octavo page size is narrower than expected, giving this tall, slim page. So we can deduce from this that Aldus took a deliberate decision to use this paper. He must have had the idea of ordered it from a paper mill for his new series. And we can look at these differences here. The chancery sheet is narrower than the narrow median sheet, which is squarer. And the chancery octavo here is squarer than the narrow median octavo, which Aldus was using. And these are accurate enough dimensions. And the ratio, the important ratio for the new octavo page size is 1 to 1.6 something or other. Even when trimmed by 1 centimetre all round, you'll get something in the ratio of 1 to 1.6. So it's an interesting innovation to order a new size of paper, but we've seen from Paul Needham's work on the incunable paper sizes that there were already variants of the 4 basic Bologna sizes in existence then. So in a sense, this is only yet another sheet size innovation, but they had to be ordered presumably specially for this new publishing venture. So here are the measurements of 6 copies of that 1501 Aldine Juvenal, and thinking about the binder who will have trimmed the copies, because one of the objections to looking at these ratios is, what about the binder's excisions from 3 sides of the book block? And the answer seems to be that it doesn't make a lot of difference. I've measured all 6 of these copies personally myself, and they go from the largest copy in the Morgan in New York, typically going for large paper copies, down to one that's been cut down really quite significantly in height in the Bodleian copy, which still produces a ratio of 1 to 1.6, lost a centimetre or so in the width as well. And they've all got various degrees of trimming by the binder, but they all come to have a ratio width to height of 1 to 1.6 something. And we can deduce that they're all 6 of these copies printed on narrow median paper. Here's the Needham calculator. If we put in 17 centimetres for the height and 10.5 centimetres for the width and click vertical chain lines and click calculate, the Needham calculator gets confused. And this is nothing to do with Paul Needham at all. It's because the tables behind this website are based solely on incunable papers, and the Aldine octavos are not incunables, 1501. So you can see that the Needham calculator can't cope with these. So both Paul and I have alternative methods of calculating these ratios. I have a nice spreadsheet for the purpose. So is Aldus's narrow median paper a genuine innovation? Are there 15th century octavos printed on narrow median sheets? Now, Paul Needham confirmed to me that he knows of no incunable narrow median octavos. That was some months ago. It may be that he knows of them now, but I think if so, they're very rare. And if only more catalogues and bibliographies recorded page sizes, we could be more secure and more sure about things like this. And another question, are there late 15th century manuscripts written on narrow median paper? It's possible that this is researchable from catalogues, but I haven't tried, and someone should, because it's possible that Aldus was using a paper that had already made an appearance, but I'm inclined to think not. Part of the Aldine popularity, it's long been recognised, was the series of counterfeits printed in Lyon during the first decade and a half of the 16th century. So by the end of 1501, beginning of 1502, a press in Lyon is issuing counterfeit editions of the Aldine classics. So here on the left, we've got the first page of text of Aldus's edition of Juvenal, and then the first 3 of the Lyons counterfeit editions. And you can see that they are page for page reprints. They're in an italic type. They handle the text in the same way. There are tiny differences. If you look here and here, you can see, yes, and there, the line breaks aren't quite the same, but to all intents and purposes, they're line by line reproductions of the Aldine, showing quite clearly how popular and marketable this new publishing innovation was. So if you're a counterfeiter, what are you going to copy? Clearly, you're going to copy the text, and you're going to copy it line by line so that it's a page for page look-alike. For the type, you need a close copy of the Aldine italic. It's not it's not so beautiful, but it is a close enough copy to fool lots of purchasers, I'm sure. But something that I think hasn't been adequately recognized is that you also need the same tall, narrow page size as the Aldine originals. Now, one way of achieving this is by taking median paper, widely available, and cutting the pages down very considerably, probably by cutting the original sheet. And this, of course, is uneconomical. The Lyon printers must have done what Aldus did, and that is order a new paper size from their suppliers to provide an economical way of counterfeiting the original Aldine appearance. And so I've taken from work I did some years ago a sample of 27 copies of Lyon Aldine counterfeits in the first 4 years and done the height to width ratio calculation. And the average of the 27 copies, 1 to 1.6, showing narrow median paper. There's an outsider that's been cut down a lot that gives 1 to 1.5, and there's an eccentric large one at 1 to 1.8, but the average is 1 to 1.6, showing that this was produced on narrow median paper, just as Aldus's editions were. So what about octavos after Aldus? I have a sample of 311 octavos printed in France between 1501 and 1520 in the British Library collections. I would have had a sample of 500 if only the lockdown hadn't happened in early March last year, or at least I'd have got to 400. It's not nice not having a round figure, but 311 will have to do. And you can see that more of these octavos were printed on super-chancery paper than any other, but if you take the two narrow formats, narrow supermedian and narrow median, they make up 42% of the total. So that includes, of course, the counterfeits from the Lyon counterfeiters, but it shows that lots of printers in this first 20 years of the century were starting to adopt the narrow octavo page size in post-incunable France. And my Excel spreadsheet has produced me this area graph, which shows proportions. Here in the center, we've got the narrow median only found in Paris and Lyon, narrow supermedian found in both of those towns and in Rouen and in somewhere else. It shows that Paris was the predominant producer still of octavos on chancery, with Lyon, Caen and Rouen and somewhere else, Troyes, I think, just producing a few. And the super chancery, which was becoming more common, particularly a Parisian paper over here on the left, with Lyon, Rouen, and then Amiens, Caen, Troyes, and somewhere else producing just a few. So there's a way of graphing the use of these different sheet sizes in the major printing towns in France in the post-incunable period. And another of my measurements of page sizes was for work I've been doing for a very, very long time on books printed by Pierre Vidou in Paris. He produced 54 octavos between the early 1520s and his death in the mid-1540s. And over 3/4 of them are printed on narrow supermedian paper and a smaller number on narrow median paper, and very few octavos on anything else, showing how the new sizes were being adopted. And of course, I've got measurements for other octavo editions of Juvenal, 60 during the 16th century, ranging from 1501 to 1599, and the average ratio is 1 to 1.6 nearly, which is narrow median, with nearly 90% produced on one or other of the two narrow median formats during the course of the century. And it shows that Aldis's innovation on page size was adopted and stayed adopted. I've got an example here from Plantin's press. It's 1565 Juvenal and Persius, octavo, with its page dimensions. It's a narrow ratio, sheep size is here, and it's a narrow supermedian. And the Plantin archives gives its name. Leon Foot's notes on this edition record Plantin's notes that the edition was printed on Petit Bâtard paper, and the English equivalent would be crown. So this reminds us again that if we measure the things, we've got the possibility of going beyond these modern scholarly sheet names, narrow supermedian, and finding the appropriate vernacular names. Philippe Gaskell's new introduction gives a list of these, but then it's not easy to relate them to physical copies, and better, more systematic measurements would help here. It's nice to know that the English equivalent of crown is Petit Bâtard in French. So, in conclusion, Aldis's innovation of 1501 wasn't just the use of italic type and octavo format for classical texts. In commissioning, as I believe, in commissioning a new size of paper, this was quickly recognized by competitors as part of the appeal of his new publication series. And there are further questions which I raise but don't necessarily have answers to. I've mentioned the question of, was narrow median paper used for manuscript production in the late 15th century? And I'd like a codicologist to give me an answer on that. That would be interesting. And given that we've looked at octavos and the range of paper sizes which could be folded 3 times to give octavos, were there similar developments in sheet sizes for the other page sizes during the 16th century, for folios, for quartos, for duodecimos with their different folding schemes? And again, I don't know the answer to that and hope someone else might do some research on it. And finally, by way of conclusion, if we're going to get very far with any of this, cataloguers and bibliographers must record page dimensions as well as formats. So there, to conclude, are my points of contact, my website, my email, my blog, which is mainly about Canterbury topics, and finally the link for this PowerPoint file should you wish to download it to extract any of the material which I've been talking about. So thank you for your attention, and I will stop the share screen now.
David, thank you so much. Really fascinating. It's wonderful to learn so mathematically about medieval papermaking and usage, and to reclaim those variants, 15th and 16th century, from those in those 4 distinct sizes, and those key innovations by Aldus Manutius for his, to say, the narrow median octavo classics through the 16th century, and to look at it for the French copiers and, as you say, counterfeiters. And you asked yourself at the end, you asked your own series of questions, but I'm now going to build on that and ask for questions and comments, please, which again should be typed in, please, to the chat facility.